Hi everyone, and welcome back. So in the last podcast, we covered the basics of what compost is and the methods for how organic waste becomes compost. In this episode, we'll be diving into why we should even care about compost and how the different methods can benefit or not benefit communities. We'll start by outlining the benefits compost can bring to people and the planet. Composting diverts food scraps and green waste away from landfills. This is particularly important in Berkeley as we work toward our zero waste by 2020 goal, which we'll discuss in detail in the next episode. Compost is also an excellent way to improve soil quality by recycling nutrients back into soil ecosystems. Compost also improves soil quality by helping to retain soil moisture, reducing the need for synthetic fertilizer application, which can cause nutrient pollution in waterways, suppressing plant diseases and pests, thus reducing the need for harmful pesticide chemicals, promoting higher yields, and remediating contaminated soils in some cases. Additionally, compost reduces soil erosion and creates green jobs. In urban areas, compost promotes small-scale urban farming and local food sourcing. Large farms can diversify farm products by selling finished compost and therefore increasing their income. Unfortunately, there can be some drawbacks to composting, as with everything, especially in large-scale compost operations. One of the biggest problems that we face today is odor, particularly for those who live near compost facilities. This can become an environmental justice issue when compost facilities and odors are located in low-income communities and/or communities of color. While people like the idea of composting, no one wants a giant composting facility next to their neighborhood. We see the not in my backyard mentality that we've seen in a lot of environmental problems happening here, as the burden of the environmental good falls on already marginalized communities. Compost can also produce high nitrogen concentrated leachate that sinks into soil and can contaminate water supplies in large quantities. Aspergillus fumigatus fungus, common in soils and composted materials, can also produce an allergic reaction in people who are exposed frequently. For example, people working at the compost facilities. Finally, large-scale compost facilities can produce a considerable amount of noise pollution for people living near them. However, it is important to remember that all of these problems can be prevented or reduced if safe practices and precautions are taken and people's views are given priority. These problems are also associated with large-scale composting operations. Therefore, one of the most effective solutions is small-scale community composting. Compost can also have some important climate and carbon sequestration impacts. And in the wake of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report saying that we have 12 years for transformative economic change, these impacts could be vastly important. We know that if food waste was a country, it would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world after the US and China. This is because when food waste is disposed in a landfill, it decomposes anaerobically, meaning without oxygen, and releases methane into the atmosphere. Methane is an extremely potent greenhouse gas with a warming effect per molecule that is 30 times that of carbon dioxide. In contrast, composting operations release little to no methane and thus reduce greenhouse gas emissions from food waste. This is a big deal, so 40% of the food produced for consumption in the US is wasted. And while the best solution is to eliminate food waste, composting can eliminate a lot of emissions from the types of food waste that are less avoidable. Composting also has indirect positive climate impacts. Using compost on farms reduces or eliminates the need for synthetic fertilizers, which decreases our reliance on fossil fuel dependent manufacturing in an industrial agricultural system. Compost also makes soil healthier due to the high amount of organic matter, and healthy soils sequester more carbon dioxide. We'll now move on to the different compost models and the pros and cons of each. But I want to preface with a disclaimer that there is a huge amount of diversity in composting methods, from closed-loop backyard systems to large-scale, technologically advanced facilities. I want us to remember that no form is the right form of composting. It's important to recognize the autonomy of communities and empower people to make their own decisions about how to compost. With that being said, let's jump into the two general compost models, centralized and localized operations. Centralized compost operations are large-scale in nature, usually involve transporting large amounts of compostable material from residences and businesses in an urban or suburban area to a regional composting facility and either back to the community or somewhere else as a finished compost product. This is the model the city of Berkeley has chosen, as well as San Francisco, Boulder and Denver, Colorado, Seattle, Washington, and Portland, Oregon. The pros of the centralized model include these operations are often run through municipal governments, meaning they have strong institutional support and funding. This allows municipal composting to handle, transport, and process large quantities of material. In the end, this usually means that more material is diverted from landfills than previously possible. These centralized systems are also fairly convenient and accessible for people. Residents must simply separate their waste into different bins, and the city comes in and covers the rest. However, the benefits of centralized composting pale in comparison to localized community compost, as we'll see later. Transporting compost to and from regional facilities requires oil-dependent trucks, which leaves a carbon footprint of its own. In addition to the problems with compost discussed earlier, this kind of composting does not solve the ultimate problem, which is the disconnect between people, their food, and the waste they create. Institutionalized programs take the compost away each week, and people are often abstracted from what happens to the compost after it leaves their site. This model also doesn't make much progress toward a closed-loop food system, both ecologically and socially. For example, here in Berkeley, only about 5% of the compostable material we send out to a composting facility comes back to us in finished compost form for the public. This leaves us with a question. What happens to the other 95%, and who is profiting from it? We now turn our attention to localized community compost systems. In this model, composting happens within the community, in people's yards and in community spaces like parks, urban farms, and public gardens. This model effectively closes the food system loop. It circulates profits and benefits within the community. Because compost improves soil health and crop yields, local compost also supports local food production and food security from community farms. Community compost is based on community inclusion and empowerment, so people's participation and environmental education are not only positive byproducts, but are also crucial to the success of the operations. Community compost also supports green areas in neighborhoods and creates local green jobs. Finally, localized operations establish a culture of compost knowledge in the community. However, this model is not without its problems. At this time, community operations are not able to compost as much material as larger facilities. This creates a quantity versus quality trade-off in many communities today. Community composting can also be more difficult because it requires a dedicated, consistent community interest and labor input. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, but provides a broad introduction into why we should compost and in what ways. In the next episode, we'll zoom in on Berkeley specifically and how both the centralized and localized models have been implemented here with mixed results. See you next time.